So this might be a repeat clinical pearl, but I think it's worth it. So this was recycled content that I put on Instagram today, and I was like, man, this is such a good pearl. I include it in a lot of my microglial slide decks and everything, and I really like making these graphics and visuals. So this is my third favorite biochemical pathway. Or it's not even really, I mean, it's like physiological biochemical. The third favorite pathway in the body, which is the cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway. Been on a little bit of a vagus nerve kick this week on social media. It's a popular subject. There's a lot of, holistic health coaches and biohackers. There's, so much chatter and emphasis on vagal tone, vagal activity, nervous system regulation. And I feel like a lot of the content that's circling that stuff is more from kind of a psychological, emotional, energetic, biohacking perspective, not quite as much from like a molecular mechanism, clinical therapeutic. And so there's opportunity for both. So certainly with vagal tone, there is tons of really good research on vagal activity, vagal tone, and really showing how low vagal tone or poor vagal tone can really dramatically just disrupt the microbiome and disrupt the intestinal lining and kind of contributing to that leaky gut, which then opens up the door for all sorts of chronic inflammatory insults. And so this cholinergic anti-inflammatory pathway is this really cool mechanism through which inflammation in the gut or inflammation in the periphery is communicated up to the brain afferently through the vagus nerve. And so it's basically this pro-inflammatory signal, which one can stimulate microglial activation and stimulate the neuroinflammatory cascade in the brain. The body's really, really smart. It knows like, hey, we're getting this inflammatory signal. It can induce the microgliosis in the brain, but then there's this mucorinic receptor, this M1 receptor. I think it's in like the amygdala or somewhere in the brain. And it receives this information to then send this efferent signal down the vagus nerve. And so then at the synaptic level, the vagus nerve is releasing, and there's a little bit of debate about this in the literature, and it seems to be both, where there's the vagus nerve will release acetylcholine, but also norepinephrine to then have a modulatory effect on the inflammation. And so specifically on macrophages and lymphocytes, we've got, can I zoom in? I sure can. I've made a very detailed graphic here. Oh no, there we go. So on macrophages, we have this nicotinic acetylcholine alpha-7 subunit receptor, which I illustrated very crudely here. And so that's a nicotine receptor, an acetylcholine receptor. And so acetylcholine and nicotine act as a ligand to activate that receptor, which then actually basically inhibits the whole NF-kappa beta, NLRP3, just the pro-inflammatory intracellular cascade. And so it's a way through which the vagus nerve is trying to reduce macrophage activation, reduce peripheral inflammation, reduce GI inflammation through releasing acetylcholine to subdue that inflammatory mechanism. And then there's also this other pathway where it's releasing norepinephrine, which binds onto this beta-2 adrenergic receptor on lymphocytes, which then seems to stimulate the release of acetylcholine to then activate that same receptor on macrophages. So kind of two different signaling molecules, two different neurotransmitters to accomplish essentially the same anti-inflammatory mechanism. So this whole thing, now obviously like without this, what is called the inflammatory reflex, this happens in real time as we get that signal going up the vagus nerve, the brain processes it and shoots down this anti-inflammatory signal down into the periphery, and it's happening, instantaneously. And so this whole thing, this whole mechanism is really dependent on good vagal tone, good vagal activity, right? And of course, the ability to have healthy norepinephrine and acetylcholine And so we can modulate this pathway, obviously, through, like stress management would be like an overarching sort of holistic theme there. Promoting vagal tone or, vagus nerve stimulation, however you want to do that, whether you're poking around your face or doing some deep breathing or some, chanting or ohms or whatever you want to do, or having a vagus nerve stimulator, a TENS unit, there's all those kind of, biohack approaches. I like therapeutics. And so from more of a therapeutic perspective, we can use things like CDP choline or just, supplemental choline, phosphatidylcholine, and even nicotine. So actually, Jill Carnahan, who's coming on, she and I were having a conversation about this when we were hanging out in Boulder earlier this year. And when I mentioned this mechanism to her and how I was super excited about it, she's like, Brendan, that must be why all my IBD patients are addicted to smoking, because they rely on that nicotine to maybe subdue some of their GI inflammation through this. So we had a nice little chat about that. So like nicotine, could be sort of a therapeutic in this case. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with that as long as it's a healthy relationship and there's no addictive issues there. But also THC acts as a selective acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. So that's also where like the acetylcholine esterase inhibiting drugs, which could include THC, could also promote more cholinergic signaling and promote this pathway and subdue inflammation. So that's where like nicotine and THC, from like a smoking perspective, it actually works on this pathway and might have some degree of, efficacy there. But I would more advocate for the choline, the CDP choline, the phosphatidylcholine on top of the vagus nerve stimulation and vagal toning exercises. But I think it's a really cool thing to be familiar with here, because obviously if there's any sort of faultiness through this whole thing, or excessive, like down here, I illustrated like a lot of endotoxemia. If there's just too many pro-inflammatory signals, too much endotoxin or whatever it is driving the inflammation, like obviously we should try to deal with what's promoting the inflammatory trigger probably first, and then, some of these anti-inflammatory mechanisms, because then it just can, potentially inhibit this whole cascade of microglial activation, neuroinflammation that I'm sort of illustrating here. So that is my clinical pearl. Hi, Naomi.